Hello, my name is Garvin, and I read things and prattle on about them on the internet for your entertainment. Welcome to Dick Month, folks, where I look at the many works of Philip K. Dick and their adaptations both in film and on television. Today, we're looking at the rather influential and somewhat experimental alternate history, Man in the High Castle. Also, after this video, we'll be looking at the first season of the television show, but this video is going to focus on the novel that show was adapted on. There is a written review in the description for the novel, so feel free to take a look at that as well. With all that said, let's get right to it, shall we? Man in the High Castle was published in 1962 and is set in an alternate 1960s where the Axis won World War II. Now you may be asking, how did this happen? In the story, FDR was assassinated in the 1930s, and instead of having a president who tried to fight the Great Depression and prepare the U.S. militarily and industrially for the coming conflict, the future leaders of America were asleep at the wheel. So there was no Two-Ocean Navy Act. There was no land lease, no destroyers for bases, no support for the British Empire, the Soviet Union, or even the Republic of China. So the Allies were instead isolated and destroyed by the Axis, one by one. Until finally, the United States was destroyed, with Nazi Germany dropping an atomic bomb on Washington, D.C. I'm not sure the assassination of FDR alone would have resulted in an Axis victory, but this is one of the more realistic and reasonable Axis victory stories that I've read. The Two-Ocean Navy Act built the fleet, and more importantly, the industry that dominated the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, even with the losses of Pearl Harbor. Land lease was incredibly important for the Allied war effort, and the sheer amount of material shipped to the Soviets let them face and destroy the majority of the Nazi army, something like 75% of it. Without the resources and the machinery provided by the U.S., the Soviets would have been hamstrung, to put it mildly, and no one else in the war would have stood a chance. Getting back to the novel, though, the Germans take the United States east of the Mississippi and divide it into two states. In the north is a puppet state ruled directly by the Reich, but there is another state referred to by the characters as just the South that seems to rule itself and is basically the Confederacy turned up to 11. No one considers it a good place to be. In the West, there is the Pacific States of America, a Japanese protectorate or possibly an outright colony, and between the Pacific States and the Reich is the Rocky Mountain States, which are at least nominally independent and serve as a kind of buffer state between Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. Most of the book is focused on three American characters, and with the exception of Juliana, their struggles are rather mundane. Robert Childen, for example, is a business owner who makes his living selling Americana to the Japanese, who have developed a kind of mania for the art and cultural artifacts of pre-war America. So they're really into things like Civil War pistols or Mickey Mouse watches. Robert finds out that a lot of the stuff he's selling, though, is actually counterfeit. As in, it wasn't made before the war, but there's instead a thriving industry in crafting copies of this stuff to sell to the Japanese. And he wasn't in on it. He quickly realizes that once this gets out, and eventually it will get out, the market will collapse. And if he's still dependent on selling this supposedly antique American craft stuff, he'll be ruined. Frank Frink is one of the guys who used to make those counterfeit artifacts, but now he wants to make jewelry of his own design with a former co-worker's help. And both of them manage to talk Childen into selling it, as he realizes he needs to diversify his offerings before the market collapse hits. But Frank has another problem, a bigger, darker problem. He's a Jew. In a world where the Nazis are in charge and have declared all Jews to be subjects of the Reich, therefore any Jew who is found must be turned over to them, and if you're Jewish and the Reich gets you, well, that's the end of you there. So Frank is trying to stay hidden, but he also wants to make something that's his instead of a copy of lost and forgotten glory. Both these men show how the defeat of the United States has honestly ruined them. They're both kind of neurotic, both more than a little self-hating, and locked into the dependency on the goodwill of the Japanese while hating the fact they're so dependent. At the same time, they've internalized their inferiority to the Japanese. Throughout the book, they look to the Japanese as a superior people and culture, and Robert, for example, repeatedly states that the United States just was never going to win the war, having been morally and spiritually hollowed out by the excesses of pre-war culture. Some of this does seem a little self-serving. It's not that the US people and government made terrible choices. You can say, oh no, this was predestined, there's nothing we could have done, and there's nothing we could do to prevent it. Which at least takes the responsibility for failure off their shoulders, but then it also locks them into this idea of being inferior to the Japanese. This is actually a pretty good look at how colonialism affects the people being colonized. Because colonization is not something that happens just in the physical material world. It's something that happens to people mentally and emotionally on an individual and group level as they watch their culture, their traditions be superseded and forced into subordinate roles that they can't escape even in their own homeland. In their own homes, they are forced to be subordinate to an outside foreign force, and that eats away at you. The Chinese book, The I Ching, serves as a front and center example of that. And let me get into a little bit of just what the I Ching is. It's a manual for telling the future, first written between 1000 and 750 BC in China, and it became one of the 5 classics, books that were considered part of the traditional canon of Confucianism, and those were works you had to study and know in order to qualify for government positions or even be considered a reputable scholar in certain points in China. And the characters in the story turn to the I Ching instead of turning to Western works, even though these are white characters living in the United States. They have abandoned things like the Christian Bible or the Jewish Torah and instead turned to the Chinese book that the Japanese use. And on top of that, and this is what makes this story kind of experimental, Mr. Dick used the I Ching as a tool to help write the story. You see, in the book, Man in the High Castle, characters go to the I Ching and try to determine their fortune when they're not sure what to do. And every time a character did that, Mr. Dick would do the same thing, and whatever answer he got from the I Ching, he put in Man of the High Castle and had that character follow the advice of the book. I've heard of some writers using tarot cards to determine plot events as well, but I have to admit this is the earliest book I'm aware of that does something like that. So, points to Mr. Dick for innovation there. Our last major character is Juliana, who is Frank's ex-wife, and she lives in the Rocky Mountain states. She gets into a relationship with an Italian truck guard named Joe, who introduces her to a book called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. This book is an alternate history in an alternate history, where the writer proposes a world where the Axis lost, but it's not our timeline. It's one where the Soviets fell, Roosevelt never ran for a 3rd term, instead a left-wing advisor of his did and won, and the US and the British Empire were the last two powers standing after the war and promptly started a Cold War against each other. And I gotta admit, I'm impressed. Mr. Dick, the utter madman, didn't just write one alternate history, he wrote two for this one book. I love this. A lot of writers would have just had The Grasshopper Lies Heavy be our timeline, but Mr. Dick is like, nah, that's not crazy enough for me, bro. You get two alternate histories for the price of one. Great stuff. The Grasshopper Lies Heavy is, of course, banned in Nazi-controlled territories, but the Japanese honestly don't care, and it's very popular. In fact, even Nazi party members are reading it, and they hate it, but they can't put it down. So, they decide to do what Nazis always do when something makes them uncomfortable. Kill it. In fact, Juliana quickly realizes she's been pulled into an assassination attempt, and I'm going to come back to this, but there's one more plot thread to cover here, and it's kind of important. So, Man in the High Castle does have Japanese and Nazi characters. The main Japanese character is Trade Minister Tagomi. In fact, he's the only Japanese character we get viewpoint chapters for, and there's a German agent posing as a Swede. He's from Nazi naval intelligence, and he's come to warn the Japanese that the Nazi government, which is coming under the newly ascended Chancellor Goebbels, is considering launching Operation Dandelion. Now, you might be asking, what the heck is Operation Dandelion? And why should I be afraid of it? Operation Dandelion is a surprise attack on the Japanese home islands, consisting of mass atomic bombardment, meant to render the islands lifeless wastelands. After which they'll storm the rest of the Japanese Empire, which would be decapitated and writhing around with its heart ripped out. And considering that the Nazis already rule vast stretches of the earth, it might be fair to ask, why are they even bothering to do this? We learned from discussions among the Japanese characters that the reason for this is, despite putting on a strong show and even sending men to Mars and the Moon, the Nazi Empire is a rotting basket case. They wasted manpower and resources on grandiose projects like damming the Mediterranean, and on pure psychotic things like depopulating Africa and purging the European populations even further. So they have a dwindling population and vast stretches of empty territory and industries being mismanaged into the ground. Which tells me Mr. Dick understands pretty damn well how a Nazi empire would actually function. Because the more you study Nazi economics, the more you realize it's an utter crap show that was first held up by massive borrowing and then attacking and looting your creditors. However, this meeting is interrupted by an attack of Nazi agents whose plan is to simply kill everyone in the Japanese building and then kill the Nazi agent. Which leads me to the following rant. Brace yourself, guys. The sheer incompetence of Nazi intelligence agents in this story is staggering. Getting back to Juliana's plot, for example, let's say you're a Nazi agent on the way to an assassination, or any type of trained assassin. Why would you pick up some random lady to come with you? Let alone let her figure out what you're up to. If you need eye candy to use as bait, you bring a woman agent in, or just send a woman to do it. Someone who is trained for this. If you don't trust women to operate alone, send a woman and a male agent. This isn't hard. It shouldn't be that difficult to figure out that grabbing some random civilian from a nation full of people who don't like you is stupid. Also, sending untrained thugs so you can maintain some deniability to storm a secret meeting of government officials in their own territory is a hell of a dumb move that is only going to provoke questions. And Honestly, if something like that happened here, I'd be screaming that we should probably turn up our defense rating and look for an attack to come. Because you only do something like that when you're desperate and you're going to be launching something really soon. I grant it was a desperation move because they couldn't get the Navy guy beforehand, but that meeting was actually held up for a few days in the book. So this is on the Nazis. They had literal days to figure out how to get this guy, and they couldn't pull it off. Now, I'm not going to say this is an unrealistic performance for the Nazis. I mean, if you go back to my Jack Boots of Atlantis video, you will see the Nazis were not a well put together group. That facade of super organization is exactly that, a facade. It is shocking just how much of a shambles the Nazi government and movement actually were. But let's move on, shall we? The ending is a bit open, to put it mildly. And Mr. Dick always did make noises about writing a sequel someday, but never actually got around to it. The only plot thread, in my view, that hits a satisfying ending is Juliana's. With Robert and Frank, we basically get a look at the stress-filled days of two men just trying to get by in a country where they have to live with a boot on their neck. With Tagomi and the Nazi agent, we get a look at middle-level functionaries picking up responsibilities way above their pay grade and trying to do the right thing while praying their bosses don't end all life on Earth. But there's no real resolution, which kind of drags the story down a bit. That is my biggest complaint, though. The novel otherwise is an interesting read and gives you a lot of food for thought. It lets you look at what colonialism is like for the people being colonized, and the struggle to simply be able to maintain basic freedoms and dignity. And Operation Dandelion puts the weight on the fact that these characters are helpless. Their fates can be decided by madmen on the other side of the planet, and they have no recourse, no appeal, no defense. And that's sobering to consider, isn't it? I think that's a note we're going to wrap up on this week. I hope you found this video informative or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or consider subscribing. All of these help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord algorithm. Dare be on his name. If you'd like a voice on future subjects, consider joining the Patreon for $1 a month. There's a link in the description below. Or you can make a one-time donation at my Kofi, also linked below. Speaking of patrons, I'd like to give a special thanks to my biggest supporter, Big Steve. As always, thanks, big dude. Next week, we look at the opening episodes of Season 1. I hope you'll join me, but until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading.